Thank you.
So, first of all, Jason, let me introduce you. You are, of course, as you know, the editor-in-chief of The New Statesman, which is described as by the left, for the left. But I think one of the things I really wanted to say, having read your book, is this is very, very apolitical. Every single party seems to come in for a very honest appraisal. You're also multi-award winning. Congratulations. We're very lucky to have you here and have been named amongst Britain's most influential 500 people in the last 10 years. So really, really fantastic to have you. And you're described as championing independence of thought and diversity of opinion. And certainly that was my impression reading this book. So I really do encourage you to take the time I have enjoyed taking to look at our country and particularly England over the last 25 years, which is what this book does, through the eyes of some very personal stories and some news events that we will all remember. And I'm just going to, before I ask you the first question, recap for all of us some of the stories that we think, oh gosh, yes, I remember that. It seemed so big at the time, but what's happened? Why did it happen, and what has been the impact of it since? So just to name check a few of them, all revisited in your book. The Brexit, the Brexit referendum, and I'd actually like to touch on the Isle of Wight's view on the referendum, of course, a very strong vote out here. The COVID pandemic and lockdown, the tragedy of the cockle pickers and what it says about people trafficking and our relationship with immigration in the country, the moving reaction of the people of Wootton Bassett, the repatriation of fallen soldiers, 3 lethal jihadi attacks in England, Shamima Begum, who went off to be a jihadi bride at the age of 15, our reaction as a country to the death of George Floyd and the rise of the BLM here, and obviously the taking of the knee. The very famous Gillian Duffy, the lady who certainly Gordon Brown will never forget. And that's to name but a few of the stories that you touch upon, the kind of big moments in our recent history. But what I wanted to start to talk to you about really is you start with this question of what it is to be, what is England now? Not so much what it is to be English, but what is England now? Who are we? Yeah. And what does all of that mean? Why did all of that happen? Why England? You're not talking about Britain or the UK here, you're talking about England.
Wow, that's a big question. Thank you for the introduction, Susanna. Wonderful to be here. Wonderful to be in the Isle of Wight again. I remember coming here in the late 70s on holiday with my parents. And I thought I was going somewhere sort of warm and exotic. And it was warm and exotic, actually, as it turned out. And the weather was, even in October, it's lovely in the Isle of Wight. So what a pleasure to be here. So thank you for being here in this wonderful church. And thank you for that introduction. And then The New Statesman, it's an open magazine. I'm skeptical. I'm interested in different points of view, reaching out across difference and not excluding. So that's what I've tried to do with the magazine since I've been editor. But that question on England, there's a line actually from George Orwell who features in the book. He was writing in 1940 during the Blitz as the bombs were coming down on London. We'd had the retreat from Dunkirk, and Orwell had been sort of hostile to his own country. He was an old Etonian, but he didn't go to university. He became a military policeman in Burma, but he didn't like the empire. He didn't like the public schools. He came back to England and he went to Wigan. And deep underground among the miners, he discovered an England that he could finally respect. What he saw among those men working deep underground, the teamwork and the camaraderie, began to change his view about what a nation is and why patriotism matters. And in 1940, as the bombs were falling on London, he wrote in a famous essay called The Lion and the Unicorn, he wrote, it is of the deepest importance to try and determine what England is before guessing what part England can play in the huge events that are happening. Now, the last 10, maybe 15 years in this country have been hugely divisive, and polarised. And it's almost been a period of continuous crises. If you think back to the financial crisis, the recession that followed, we had the Scottish independence referendum, which almost led to the breakup of the British state. It was a narrow vote for the status quo, but narrow. One consequence of that 2014 vote was the collapse of the Labour Party in Scotland. So 2015, David Cameron won a surprise majority, which enabled him then to have the in-out referendum on British membership of the European Union that he had pledged. We had the eruption of the radical left and the Corbynites in 2015. We had the Brexit wars through to 2019 when Boris Johnson finally took us out on a rather crude pledge to get Brexit done, whatever that means. Then we were hit by the pandemic. I mean, it's just been an extraordinary period. And so I wanted to try and understand what these huge events mean and what role England has hit and what is England today, because I think England has been lost within Britain and within Britishness. And all around us, we've seen the rise of nationalist movements, particularly the Scottish independence movement. And inevitably, that's forced upon the English a reconsideration as to who they are. England is the largest country that doesn't have representation at the United Nations. It doesn't have its own discrete political institutions. And maybe we're fine with that. Maybe we're very relaxed about England being part of a larger multinational state. And I also value Britishness greatly, and we can talk about that. But what is England? Who are the English today? And that was something that really interested me. And that's why I began the exploration, which became the book.
It's fantastically interesting seeing the culture of the country through the lens of different individuals and events.
Yeah.
And that can only really be understood, again, if you read the very personal stories that feed into the bigger themes of Englishness that go through the book, which are wonderful. I think what's interesting is you start off very locally in Harlow in your book with your aunt. And this is really reflecting the importance of everyday life and community. Yeah. And you juxtapose that with globalization, which is tied into the story of the cockle pickers and people trafficking. And I think, you know, there's another whole piece around how Europe itself has lost its identity and doesn't know what its role is. So again, can you talk a little bit about, because I think when we look at this island community, the importance really of sort of local identity alongside English identity and the importance of community, because that seems to underpin everything.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the local and communities and how we interact, not just within our own families, but in wider groupings. I mean, what I call sort of intermediate institutions between the market and the state, such as churches, sports clubs, trade unions, and so on. And since 1997, when Tony Blair came to power, Blair's a progressive, and he wanted to ride this wave of progressive change. He said, why debate globalization and its effects? It's inevitable as the changing of the seasons. Well, actually, a lot of people wanted to debate the effects of globalization, and particularly what it had done to local communities and how certain communities had been disturbed by these enormous forces that had changed not only the United Kingdom, but Europe and beyond. I mean, globalization lifted hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty, which is a good thing. But there were also detrimental effects. But Blair wanted to ride this wave. I grew up, many of you won't know it, I grew up in one of the new towns that was created after the Second World War in a place called Harlow in Essex, West Essex. These new towns were created by the Attlee government, the Labour government, that won a landslide in 1945. Clement Attlee had become Winston Churchill's deputy in the wartime coalition. Former soldier, carried off the battlefield at Mesopotamia and was at Gallipoli, and was an old-style patriot, as well as a Labour Prime Minister. He believed in the nation, and he wanted to dignify ordinary people's lives by building institutions. So they passed the New Towns Act of 1946, and Harlow was created as a consequence. One reason was to create housing for working class people from the East End of London, where my parents came from, and the poorer parts of North London, because so much housing had been destroyed in the Blitz. And Harlow was a noble project. In many ways, it was a utopian project. The idea of creating housing with gardens and lavatories inside the houses and green spaces. And it attracted progressives, socialists, even communists to the town. And I was born there in the late 60s, and I just grew up in the 1970s. And someone once said to me, growing up in Harlow in the 1970s was a bit like being in the old GDR, but without the Stasi. Everything was provided for you by the state. Our recreational spaces, our sports clubs, our schools, and so it goes on. I didn't understand any of this. I was just growing up. This is where I happened to live. And inevitably, when you try and create a utopian settlement, and we were called citizens of the future, and Lord Reith, the first Director General of the BBC, who worked on one of the New Towns Committee, called the New Towns Essays in Civilization. But when you create a utopian project or attempt to create a utopian project, inevitably, it begins to sort of crumble from within. And Harlow began to decline quite rapidly, and later on became sort of caricatured as one of the left-behind towns. I mean, it's only 25 minutes from London Liverpool Street Station, the gateway to the gleaming metropolis of the financial district. But you visit Harlow today, it's run down, the estates are run down, nothing was renewed. The town centre, which I remember as a young boy, was vibrant and teeming. More recently, it was desolate, boarded up shops, and so it goes on. So what I witnessed was the breakdown of a community. My mother's 87, she has a sister who's 92, and another sister who's 95. The men are long gone, but the women are the strong ones in our family. And my aunt still lives there. She's 95, and a couple of years ago there was her local GP. What do you call them? Surgery. And I remember, because I lived very close to this GP surgery in a place called Prentice Place, it was announced that it was going to be closed down. No warning, no discussion, just arbitrarily closed down. The local Conservative MP, Robert Halfon, good man actually, knew nothing about it. He mounted a small campaign, nothing was done. It was a fait accompli. And my aunt then was about 90, and she mounted a local campaign to try and save this GP service, not least because it mattered to her. It was part of a community. And she was defeated. And I did a little interview with her in the New Statesman just talking about the themes. And it was picked up by the Daily Mail and other newspapers. And she was interviewed, the BBC interviewed her. And because of their greater resources, they were able to investigate what happened. And it turned out the ultimate owners of this local GP surgery was in America. Yeah. It was a huge financial conglomerate that was in St. Louis. And it was no longer financially viable, although it was an NHS service. So I didn't quite understand that. But my aunt, aged 90, had to take 4 buses to get to the nearest GP surgery after her local GP was closed down. And for me, this mattered. So I went back to the town where I'd grown up to find out what had happened, how this had happened. And it made me interested in the themes of globalization that you mentioned. And in many ways, that's the beginning of the book. And all the stories in the book are about transitions, crossings, migrations, movements across borders, into England, out of England. And one of the journeys I take is to go back to that utopian settlement that had declined.
And I think what's really interesting is it's very hard, isn't it, to create utopia? Yeah. It's kind of ludicrous. You think, oh, I'm going to create this amazing space, it's going to have a school, it's going to have this, everyone's going to be happy. You set it up, people move in, maybe they are living a better life, but then the next generation move out because they've moved on. So I think what's very interesting is the shifting culture of a country. Yes. But also what a big theme through the book for English, well, I'll say culture, is this sense of loss that you talk about, a sense of nostalgia, something that is missing, something that's got lost along the way, a need to belong, but certainly in our political parties, and a lack of willingness to take ownership of Englishness. Yes. And so it's almost like an amorphous thing, isn't it,
Yeah.
Englishness? There's an awkwardness about it. How do we feel about our past? Should we feel shame, or should we just embrace and say it's part of who we are? And how do we look at a lens of Englishness today? These are all very difficult, but can you talk a little bit about, because I think it underpinned the Brexit result, if I understand correctly from your book, and again, obviously a strong outvote here, is this sense of not being heard, that politicians weren't listening, they didn't get it.
Yes.
And also a sense of being left behind, that a few people were being taken on this globalisation journey quite happily, and a lot of people being left behind outside the cities going, you're not listening to me. And the wonderful passage, which I'm going to look up now while you're answering the question, from Gillian Duffy, who really hit the nail on the head with that, I think. She was a warning, a canary in the mine about the Brexit vote.
I think so. She was, I call her the visitor from the future. Do you remember that? Gillian Duffy in Rochdale. She appeared before Gordon Brown. She was heading actually off to buy some milk and some bread that morning. And she saw all these cars and black limousines. And someone said to her, oh, Gordon Brown's in town, then Prime Minister. And a woman called Sue Nye, who was Gordon Brown's gatekeeper. And she said to Mrs. Duffy, are you Labour? And she said, of course I'm Labour. And Sue Nye said, would you like to meet the Prime Minister? And Mrs. Duffy said, of course. So the gatekeeper opened the gate and Mrs. Duffy walked right through it. It's on YouTube if any of you want to see it again. It's an absolutely wonderful exchange. And she was asking important questions about the local environment, the economy, student debt, and she eventually asked a question about immigration. But it wasn't a racial question at all. It was a question about freedom of movement and the movement into the UK from the eastern states that had joined the European Union. And she was asking Gordon Brown about the effects of that. Entirely reasonable. She was dismissed as a bigot by Gordon. Gordon was caught on camera on a secret mic, a bit like this one, if I leave this one on today. And he got caught out. But I thought it was a really emblematic exchange because when she appeared before Gordon Brown, she must have seemed like a relic from the past that Tony Blair was trying to escape from. The old Labour, the old working class Labour voter. But actually, she'd arrived before Gordon Brown to warn him about what was coming, not only for the Labour Party but for the country. And I caught up with her many years later in the book, and we had a nice chat. And she voted for Brexit. And I think her analysis of Brexit is similar to yours. I don't know what your personal view is, but your summary of my view in the book is that in many ways people were given the opportunity to vote on something important. The turnout was huge. This idea that people weren't well informed about what they were voting for, as what the London elites might say, was nonsense. People wanted to say enough, or many people wanted to say enough, no more. And that's why Nigel Farage's rhetoric resonated for so many. This idea, Susanna, I want to get our country back. Nigel was a populist and an agitator, but some of what he said cut through, and there are more moderate versions of what Nigel was saying that others resonated for many. Harlow voted 68% Brexit. Isle of Wight was 62%. Every district of Essex voted for Brexit. And for many, I think it was an expression of mass disaffection, a reflection that the status quo for many was intolerable. And many Labour MPs in the north were campaigning in what we now call the so-called red wall seats. And they were knocking on the door saying, we want, are you with us? Are you going to vote Remain? And they were saying, look, I haven't had a pay rise for 10 years. Can't get my child into the local school, the GP service doesn't work. And when I go into town, I hear a lot of people speaking Romanian and Polish. This is what was being reported. I always welcome migrants to the country, but this was what was being reported. And the Labour MPs had no answer to it. So when David Cameron said to voters, you will be worse off if you vote for Brexit, they were prepared to take that gamble. What are we, 7 years later? Was it a gamble worth taking? I'll leave it for you to decide. My view, I'm not prescriptive. I have my views, but the book is open. I ask questions rather than offer definitive answers. If you want to know what I think, It's in the New Statesman, not in the book.
But I think it raises a really interesting question around politics today, doesn't it? Or the whole area of politics and politicians. They've almost got sealed off in their own narrative. And I wanted to just read a little passage because I think we may all relate to this. So you talk about how Joan Didion described how the political process was excluding the people for whom it professed to speak. It was becoming limited to its own professionals, to those who manage policy, to those who report on it, to those who run the polls, and to those who quote them, to those who ask and those who answer the questions on the Sunday shows, to the media consultants, to the columnists, to the issue advisors, to those who give off-the-record breakfasts, and to those who attend them, to the handful of insiders who invent year in and year out the narrative of public life. Yeah. And I think, again, I'm sure many people can think that politics in itself has become a little bit of a bubble. So let's just touch on that briefly, because we see the politics of Scotland being extremely forthright and maybe more connected to its nation than the English politics. And as you mentioned, we don't have our own sort of house, if you like. Forum, yes. So what has England lost in not having that?
I think things are beginning to change because of all of the things that I explore in the book and some of what you've touched on in our conversation. I mean, does seem to me like a new era that we've entered, and I can talk about that. Obviously, the creation of the Scottish Parliament allowed a flourishing of Scottish national identity. I don't know if anyone's from Scotland here in the audience. But the SNP are opportunistic and quite cynical, I think. Mm-hmm. And actually, interestingly, they're coming unstuck in very interesting ways, because although no doubt there's legitimate movement for Scottish independence, if I was in Scotland, I would be frustrated at what's going on at Westminster, and I would be seeking greater autonomy and self-determination. I understand the forces that have driven Scottish independence. But equally, the devolution settlement that was introduced by Tony Blair enabled the SNP, once it finally won power in Scotland, to claim all the successes of the British state as its own and blame all the mistakes on Westminster. So it was a very convenient outcome, I think, for Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon. But which other serious country would have a husband and wife team as Prime Minister and Chief Executive? In many ways, I admire Nicola Sturgeon as a politician, but her husband was CEO of the SNP for 22 years. And as this begins to unravel, and of course no one's been charged, a lot of Scottish voters are turning away from the party. And also, no nationalism is entirely benign. And there is definitely, on the harder edges of the SNP or the Scottish independence movement, some quite sort of unpleasant agitators, I think. We saw that in the so-called activities of the cybernats online during the referendum campaign. But I understand the forces that have driven Scottish independence. And I don't think the English have had a forum in which to discuss what it is to be English today. The Labour Party seems very, very anxious about the English question. They're very happy to embrace Scottishness in Scotland and Welshness in Wales. But it's Britain. It's the Union Jack rather than the flag of St. George in England. And I've asked Keir Starmer about this, and he always looks a bit edgy when I do. And, of course, we're a patriotic party, or he's trying to reclaim Labour as a patriotic party because those who came before, many doubted their belief in the institutions or their support for the institutions of the British state. But there's still uneasiness about the English question, I think.
Yeah, so you talk about a sort of fear amongst politicians of what would be unleashed if there was a sort of a recognition of the importance of Englishness or Englishness as its own entity.
Yes, but it's been suppressed, hasn't it? But if you look at someone like Gareth Southgate, the England football manager, I think he's one of the most thoughtful and interesting commentators on Englishness today. He's both a traditionalist and a patriot, but he's also open to the diversity of his young team and indeed embraces and encourages it. Why should a football manager I mean, he's a very intelligent man, but why should a football manager be braver to discuss these issues than our politicians?
I think what's very interesting is in a time of rolling 24-hour media and social media, sometimes it's people like the England football manager
Yes.
or a big music star like Stormzy,
Yeah.
who can relate to people
Yeah.
more immediately and more effectively than politicians who we're, again, and I want to move off politics because
Yes.
there's some other great stories,
Yeah.
who are not really telling us the truth for fear of our reaction to that truth.
Yes.
And again, please buy the book because there's some great statistics and some great stories in there about politicians trying to navigate this very difficult pathway between, well, we're going to have to sign up to this, but if we tell everyone this, that's going to cause this, and so we'll just sort of carry on and brush it under the carpet, and maybe that's a bit British as well. I know we were called out by the Dutch Prime Minister during the Maastricht Treaty saying, you're not going to tell them, are you?
You're not prepared to tell
You're
the
not
truth.
prepared to tell the truth to the Brits. He could see it and we weren't told the truth. So again, a great passage to read.
Just a little coda on that, though. I think it's also because in the 1970s, the flag of St. George was claimed by the far right, the neo-fascist right, the BNP, and others. And there, understandably, there's anxiety about that kind of harder-edged, hardcore, unpleasant, exclusionary English nationalism. But why should we allow a few extreme far-right thugs to define what it means to be English and to have ownership of the flag? And we've begun to see in recent years the flag be reclaimed as something benign and open and inclusive, much closer to what Britishness is, the British identity, which is a very welcoming identity. And I think since the Second World War, no European country has absorbed so many migrants in the way that... So you have to be careful here because, of course, there's been periods of racism and exclusion, but I think Britain on the whole has been admirable in the way it's absorbed new communities into the country.
And I think one event can speak volumes, and I just want to read another passage. So you may remember during the Black Lives Matter rallies post the death of George Floyd in America, it was hugely emotional. We had Keir Starmer taking the knee, footballers taking the knee.
That was quite comic, though.
And kind of people going, what, are you woke signalling? Am I going to get cancelled? All these words we have now. But quietly, there was a big Black Lives Matter movement, demonstration of support in London. And the EDL were turning up there with that flag, I guess.
EDL being the English Defence League. Tommy Robinson and his chum.
Exactly. So again, we have the use of the George flag there. But one man who, a very large black guy, thought, do you know what, there could be a bit of trouble down there today.
Yes.
I'm just going to go down from my home, I'm just going to check it out. And I want to remind you of what happened that day when he went down. Later that afternoon, something remarkable happened to Patrick Hutchinson. He's this guy who went down, that changed his life and set him on a new path. During clashes outside Waterloo Station on the South Bank, he noticed one of the counter-protesters, so one of the EDL. A shaven-headed white man wearing a T-shirt and denim shorts had become isolated. A multiracial mob was closing in on him at the top of a flight of stairs where he had stumbled. I cannot watch a man being beaten to death, Hutchinson thought. Without hesitation, he made his way through the crowd. There were, he thinks, as many as 300 people gathered around. Employing a fireman's carry, he scooped up the fallen man and with his comrades creating a protective corridor, he carried him through the crowd to safety and delivered him to a group of nearby police officers who, rather than intervene, had been using selfie sticks to film the unrest on their phones. So again, we've got the establishment, politicians, police, all very difficult for them. They're all navigating difficult times. But two individual men representing two very different belief systems, different cultures, different sort of lenses through which they view their own identity. That interaction caught, obviously, on social media, hugely powerful.
Hugely powerful.
A Gillian Duffy moment, a Patrick Hutchinson moment, a Gareth Southgate moment, a sort of football moment. It brings unity, doesn't it? It's sort of the lens that we see we are changing.
Yeah, I like these little moments of these small interventions that have a greater meaning. They're microcosms for something more meaningful and deeper, I think. And I admire courage when someone intervenes at a moment of crisis. And it's worth looking at the photographs of his character, Patrick Hutchinson, carrying this, essentially a thug on his back, but probably saved his life or saved him getting a really terrifying beating. And that was a noble moment and a noble intervention. And it's about building reconciliation, creating moments of harmony, reaching out across difference. That's what interests me. I don't like antagonism and hostility and hatreds and strident abuse. I want a more dignified way of conducting our politics and public life. And I found that very moving, actually, as a consequence.
I think it's very interesting that you talk about in the book, because again, I think we all recognise that. I think we are a gentle, kind, decent, dignified nation.
Have you spent Saturday night in Newcastle City Centre?
I haven't, but I would still believe that. But you talk about the fact that sort of England's narrative. What do we say about ourselves? Again, I will talk about the Scots have a great narrative, and the English really lack a narrative. But interestingly, you note that a melancholy nostalgia is present from the very beginning of English literature about ourselves. What is this melancholy nostalgia that we have? What is our narrative?
It's a very good question. I think on England, there are many Englands and many different Englands. So when you say England is sort of gentle and kind, there are examples of the opposite, of course. So loss and melancholy. It is there right at the beginnings of English literature. It's there in Shakespeare. It's there in Chaucer, but it goes back even deeper than that, before the Norman conquest. This idea that there was a deeper, more pure, a true England that has somehow, somewhere been lost. And often for many, Englishness is associated with landscape and the countryside and the rural rather than the city. But it's there. It's not just a recent phenomenon since the Second World War or the loss of empire. It's there right in landscape poetry or lyric poetry. And think of some of the great speeches in Shakespeare, John of Gaunt, and so on. As I say, it's there in Chaucer. But there is a sort of recognisable England, which an Anglo-Saxon settlement, recognisably calling itself England, a unitary state, going back before the Norman conquest. It's an old country. So when Tony Blair in 1995 said, I want to lead a young country, I want this to be a young country, as if such a thing can be willed into being. It's a very old country, as is Scotland. And the Act of Union, 1707, created the state we call Great Britain today, the complex multinational state. But there's something much older than that.
And who do you think is responsible for getting that narrative out? So our politicians have singularly failed.
I'm trying.
Yes, good. You are, happily.
I'm trying.
So, we aren't cool Britannia. We're not all of those things. Again, Scotland seems to have this very strong identity. Do you think it's going to be the media that creates that narrative, or do you think it is a narrative that emerges from our communities and our cultures? So again, let's touch on Wootton Bassett.
No, that.
I think that's what comes through the book. So we've talked about one moment in time there. Let's talk about Wootton Bassett as a emerging demonstration of our national identity, maybe.
Yeah, Wootton Bassett, if you recall, is the town in Wiltshire, small market town, and by chance, really, the bodies of the fallen soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq were coming back to Lynham, RAF Lynham. Brize Norton, where they should have come back, the runway was closed, so they were coming back into Lynham on their way back to the John Ratcliffe Hospital in Oxford. And just by chance, Wootton Bassett was on the route through which the hearses were carrying the bodies of the fallen soldiers. And early on, something began to stir within the town as the cars passed through, and people began to appear along this very long, narrow high street. And gradually, something began to build. spontaneously, wasn't directed from the top, wasn't organised. It was simply the local people coming together to honour those who had been fallen. And then as time went on, the cars began to stop. There was a kind of ceremony of mourning. And my wife's cousin was the 100th soldier to be repatriated through Wootton Bassett. He was a bomb hunter, a sapper from the Royal Engineers, and he was out in Helmand Province looking for IEDs. And just behind him was the guy who would defuse the bomb if Lauren Moulton Thomas, the bomb hunter, found one. And he was walking very quietly one Sunday morning in Helmand Province, very hot, dry morning, and his foot became trapped in a hole in the ground. And he stopped, tried to move his foot and couldn't. And his friend behind said, what's the problem here? He said, I think I'm trapped. I've trod in something. So the other soldier, a chap called Ken Bellringer, came over to find out what had happened. And he saw that Lauren's foot was in what he thought was a rabbit hole. But when he looked more carefully at it, it had very straight edges. It was certainly not been made by a rabbit or an animal. And they realized it was an IED. But it may have been disturbed and hadn't gone off. Under military rules, this is what's called a Category A situation. And Ken Bellringer could have left Lauren there, trapped. He could have said, look, I'm going to get some help, and not returned. But actually he stayed and tried to lift my wife's cousin out of the trap. And you can imagine what happened next. Lauren was blown into a nearby wadi, dead. Ken Bellringer's legs were blown off. His testicles were destroyed, damaged. He lost fingers. He was the most severely injured soldier in Afghanistan, but survived. Although he's profoundly disabled. But Lauren Moulton Thomas came through Wootton Bassett as the 100th fallen soldier. Inevitably, that caught my attention. But what I liked about the Wootton Bassett repatriations was that it wasn't something that came from the top. It wasn't something that people were told to do. It was a local community mobilizing, not politically, to honor the fallen. And it very quickly became a site of conflict. The English Defence League got involved. They turned up, wrapping themselves in the flag. A hardline Islamist group was threatening to have its own parades through the town with an empty coffin because they wanted the British government to consider the Muslim dead as a consequence of the American-led invasion. So it immediately became something greater than what it was. It caught the attention of the world's press. Barack Obama spoke about it, and very soon the world's media was descending upon this small town in Wiltshire. And the chapter about Wootton Bassett is, I call it the town that wept. The town that wept, and something noble happened there, something meaningful, and I wanted to go back and think about it, about what had happened and what it meant. What it told us about the kind of people that we are. You might sound a bit of a romantic, but I think these kinds of things matter, and they shouldn't be forgotten.
I think it's a particularly touching moment when you talk about a fallen dog handler was brought back, and all of the people brought their dogs out, and you could just hear the dogs in the silence. It's deeply touching, and again, it's our culture on display.
I think so.
And I think one of the things I take out from your book, and I'm going to come to questions now, is that culture is really bigger than anything.
Yes.
History, your culture is built on your history and obviously your national psyche, and it kind of eats politics. It eats, any given moment in time, but every so often it emerges and you see it on display. And as you say, it's not a top-down thing. We can't be told who we are or how to behave or what we should be. It comes from the edges and it grows up through us through time. Yeah. And I think there was and I'm just trying to find it here because I think there's a wonderful Orwellian quote, which is, England has the power to change out of recognition and yet remain the same.
Yeah. I've got that quote here.
Perfect. We both picked the same one. Good.
It's a wonderful quote because I think it's important. Orwell, 1940. What can the England of 1840 have in common with the England of 1940? But then, what have you in common with the child of 5 whose photograph your mother keeps on the mantelpiece? Orwell says nothing, except that you happen to be the same person.
That's beautiful.
That's a definition of national identity.
It really is.
Everything changes, but something remains the same. That's what interests me.
And I think, again, what I really took out of this book is that all of these headlines we read, it's not a headline, it's not a moment in time, it's a reflection of who we are.
Yes.
And it's often had an impact of who we are becoming too. So again, it's made me think about how I absorb big news stories and what they really mean. Once the media are long gone and we've stopped talking about it, there's just that little shift and that little refining, but it's still very much a reflection of who we always were, which is wonderful.
And the stories we tell us who we are. So that's why I tell stories in this book, rather than pontificate and polemicize.
It's a very, very human read.
I'm going to take you where I go.
Oh no, for me, I'm all about the stories.
No, thank you, Suzanne.
But anyway, thank you so much. Again, it's so hard when there's so much to talk about to
thank you so
pick
much.
a few bits. But let's come to everybody here. If you've got any questions, we've got a lady at the back there.
There's a microphone coming.
Thank you very much. That was very inspiring and very thoughtful. And my question has changed about 5 times during the talk. I have to own up, I'm a West Essex girl. I'm from Loughton, so I know.
How are you? I know Loughton.
Well. I'm fortunate to be able to live here and in London.
Yeah.
And for many years, I felt they were 2 different countries.
Yes.
But recently, as a result of the lockdown, London has changed. My neighbourhood has changed. Now, it's changed out of all recognition since I first moved there 30 years ago to that district. And it's now people from everywhere. But a sense of community is one I recognise from here. Can anyone become English?
Yes, I think so. I think it's not about blood and soil or ethnicity. It's about committing to as you say, a community of belonging, and that's the key. And I would never wish to exclude anyone who wishes to identify as English and be English. I mean, we see that I think beautifully in our sports teams, and we are a diverse and open society. It's interesting what you say about London, because some say London was the 5th nation of the United Kingdom, and it's in many ways it's a sort of vast and unknowable city, but also it's a city of interconnecting urban villages. And I was wandering around part of West London recently I didn't know at all, and it was like a little bit like wandering around the Isle of Wight. I mean, just once I got off the main road and turned into certain neighbourhoods, there was small shops and people, small coffee shops, and a bakery and a greengrocer, and people going about their business. I liked that very much. So yeah, good that you're from Loughton. I know Loughton well. Anyone else from Loughton? You, sir, from Loughton? No. Yeah, I do. Yes. I know.
That's touched on in the book, yeah.
I do think that's strange, and I do touch on it in the book, because maybe it shouldn't, but it does bother me actually. Recently, when England played Scotland in football, Scots sang "Flower of Scotland," and the national anthem was absolutely abused. Yeah, it's also their anthem as well, and I understand maybe it was just sort of pantomime booing, but it was pretty ferocious. The cricket team use Jerusalem, don't they, sometimes? Do the rugby team use Jerusalem? Although I noticed for the cricket match yesterday, England got absolutely smashed by New Zealand. But they maybe because it was a World Cup, God save the Queen had returned. But yeah, it is an interesting question, that. I don't know what others think, whether England should have its own national anthem as opposed to God Save the King. Hands up.
Yes, we should.
Yeah. Who's relaxed on this issue? Don't mind at all.
Many.
And quite a few don't know. Like a perfect opinion poll.
Isn't it?
That's
Any
a good question,
other questions? Great question. There's a lady at the front. So a lady asked, has the term multiculturalism backfired or failed?
This was Suella Braverman, wasn't it? Her comment she made last week. She's an extraordinary politician, isn't she? I mean that speech she gave at conference. I mean, that's probably the most hardline anti-immigration speech I've seen given by a mainstream conservative politician for decades. I mean, really, going back to sort of the early 70s even, or the mid-70s. Depends what, I think with multiculturalism, it's really complex because I'm not quite sure what it means. Does it mean there's a coexistence of cultures and one respects those cultures? I think that's one definition. Is there a majority culture and minority cultures, and you extend your liberal respect and tolerance to the minority cultures? I think that's the case. But where it becomes more problematic is when the minority culture rejects the majority culture, as can be seen at times, and then it becomes contested. But you know, most modern states, most modern European states, are now both multi-ethnic and multicultural. Therefore, the key for me is how do you bring sort of diverse communities together? How do you create an overriding national identity which helps us all cohere and live harmoniously? And that's the key question, I think, for me.
It's called the National Health Service.
Yeah.
It's our greatest asset.
Yes.
It's our most multinational.
Yes.
I've worked in it for
Yes.
2 years.
Yeah.
I've made the same meal twice.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
It's an absolute bastion of multinational.
I agree with that. I agree with that. And loved as
We don't use it enough.
no. And those institutions that sort of transcend the nation, the individual nations of the multinational state, and bring everyone together, they're very important, and there aren't many of them left. The BBC, the NHS, what else can we think of?
Football?
But we
But
break
yes,
we
that's
break
true.
into our own
Yes.
national teams
Yes, we
and
do.
clubs.
Oh yes, of course we do.
Maybe the Olympics when GB, but I do
Yeah.
agree with you about the NHS, and I would say the BBC, although the BBC in many ways deserves some of the criticism it gets. I mean, it really does. And I have my own problems with the BBC. There's still something sort of noble about the original idea behind it, to inform, to inform, educate and entertain. The Reithian values, there's something noble about that. But these are great questions because these are live issues. Multiculturalism, what brings people together, what brings diverse communities together, how do you help diverse communities to cohere? I mean, I might obsess about them. Others are very relaxed about these issues, but they certainly interest me.
You talked a little bit about hoping that COVID and lockdown would give us a chance to reflect and reset and think about our values a little bit. Did it change us? I mean, this lady talked about, the community in London and here and how it changed. Do you think COVID and lockdown and the shared experience of the pandemics changed England in any way?
It certainly changed England. You can't live through the shock of the pandemic, the worst pandemic in Europe for 100 years, and not be changed by it. And I still think we're grappling with the consequences of COVID and the lockdowns that followed, not least for children who, what happened in schools. My son's 14, he's an only child, and he really didn't like being locked down, couldn't see his friends, couldn't play sport, didn't enjoy Zoom teaching. And I think the long term, and also there's, what are we now? 500,000 children, so-called ghost children, have disappeared from schools, have never gone back after lockdown. So yes, we've been changed by it. I was hoping that the social solidarity that was no doubt shown during that period would change the way we interacted, worked, communicated. I don't think it has. What it has changed is how we work. I mean, people don't go into the office as much, which is probably a good thing. Sometimes I turn up in my office on a Friday, there's no one there. I hope they're having a long weekend. But yeah, it has changed us, but it's so recent that I think we're still trying to understand how. Do you agree?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
But I think the change is going to come through the generation behind us.
Yes.
I think it's a
Yes.
generational shift through their experiences built on
Yes.
the shoulders of our history.
Yeah.
And they're growing up in a very, very different country to the one even we did.
I think that's right.
So
So
again,
if there's hope, it lies with the young.
yeah, I was thinking,
Yeah.
because I think it comes from underneath. Change comes from the sides and
Yeah.
underneath, not by being told. You know, a lot of corporations have discussions around what's our mission purpose,
Yeah.
who are we,
Yeah.
you know, what's our role in the world, what are our values. I mean, you can't really sit down as the monarchy, the political parties. You know, who's going to have that conversation about England?
Yeah.
You know, if you don't inherently know that, you can't really just enforce it. So we see it through these stories and moments in time, don't we?
I also think huge changes are coming because of the climate emergency, the energy transition over the next decades ahead. I mean, I think the change, the way we work and consume,
Change everything.
how we receive our energy supplies and so on will be utterly transformed. And then into the mix comes AI, artificial intelligence. You know, the new robotics and machine learning, that again is going to utterly change. I mean, so long as there aren't catastrophic wars in the decades ahead, which is entirely possible, as we know from human history, unimaginable what the world will be like in 100 to 150 years. I mean, really unimaginable, I think, because of new technologies and the changes that, you know, we've experienced in our lifetime. Imagine how they're going to be accelerated by artificial intelligence.
Sorry.
There'll be two robots sitting here
There will.
before too long.
We have a question there.
How do you think the saga of HS2
Oh.
will affect the unity of England?
Oh boy, I'm glad I'm not a politician. That's a tough question. I need to think more about what's happening there. I think we have a comment piece in the New Statesman this week, because we like sort of a role for an active state, you know, an interventionist state. We don't like leaving everything to the market and market forces. But clearly there was a lot of control over HS2 and its budgets. But I do worry about connectivity in the north. Because if you imagine HS2 was kind of, is that a T? So you had the line going up to Manchester and then the line going east and west. And as I understood it, the line going north was the hub that connected everything else. So you try getting a train from sort of Leeds to Manchester or from Leeds to Liverpool. Yeah, you can't get anywhere. So, and I have family in the northwest, so I know that part of the country very well. And it's got a very good interconnected motorway network. But try getting anywhere on trains. What do you think about it?
I think it was a fast one. Personally.
Yeah, I think that's a definitive statement. Yeah.
We have another question. Oh, we've got 2 or 3 now. So, gentleman at the back or over here?
I thought the comment you made about how the Brexit vote, the perhaps unexpected Brexit vote, was an opportunity for people who felt they were unrepresented, didn't have a stake in England to make their point. I offer no value judgment on this at all, but I simply observe that a greater and greater proportion of people are now recognizing that it might have been a terrible mistake. Do you think that's a fair price to pay for democracy?
It's a good question. I'm a great believer in democracy, but I'm very suspicious of referendum. And I think it was probably too much of a strategic risk on something as fundamental as your national interest and your foreign policy, to cast it out on one binary plebiscite. Simple yes and no. There could have been a better way of doing it. I understand there was a lot of unrest and agitation about the European question. There hadn't been a referendum since 1975, when Harold Wilson's Labour Party sort of confirmed British membership of the then European community. But there could have been a smarter way of doing this, maybe 2 referenda, rather than just one, maybe building in a majority. 60-40, it's such a huge change. Can you imagine the Chinese losing control of their foreign policy in the way that the British did? I imagine what will happen is I presume Keir Starmer wins the election next year. He won't seek to take Britain back into the European Union, but he will seek closer relations. He'll be more pragmatic than the present Conservative government. He'll seek to build alliances. A senior diplomat said to me at the time of the Brexit referendum, he said it would take 10 years to leave properly, 10 years to realise it hasn't worked, and 10 years to get back in on the terms that you want. But that's a long cycle, 30 years. So who knows what the European Union will be like in 20 years? That's another question there. Yeah,
so sorry, I'll just say the lady's asked about lack of information.
Yeah.
And if we'd had different information, would it have been a different outcome?
Yeah, because I think, who knows? But I think the process should have been different, as I just said in answer to the gentleman's question. It could have been citizens' assemblies before the vote, a second vote once you realise what the terms of leaving would actually be. I mean, you can do this smarter and better in the way that Ireland, for example, debated the abortion question in Ireland and how that was then changed. But a lot of that involved citizens' assemblies. And you can do this much smarter than David Cameron did it. David Cameron was supremely confident, insouciant even, smooth, fluent, presentable, a good speaker, used to winning until he didn't, till the day he lost. I remember a story I was told by Ken Clarke, the Europhile Conservative cabinet member who returned to the Osborne-Cameron cabinet, pro-European. And when he knew that Cameron wanted to hold this in-out referendum, he pulled David Cameron to one side and said, "David, do you know the risk you're taking? What if we lose?" And David Cameron took Ken Clarke's arm and said, "Don't worry, Ken, I always win." Really?
So what information could have been given to make everything clearer for people to base a better decision upon, I presume?
Explain exactly what European membership of the European Union entailed. What was the customs union? What is the single market? Why was there freedom of movement? What would be lost if we left? Certain alliances and what institutions would leave London, for example. What about the Erasmus scheme? What about the movement of students? I mean, so much could have been explained better. I mean, I'm interested in politics, but I didn't know as much as I should have done about how the European Union worked, and I just don't think. I mean, it was disastrous the way David Cameron handled it.
But I think, again, what I learned from your book was it really goes back to the Maastricht Treaty. It's kind of where it began, the lack of being able to be totally transparent about freedom of movement. Absolutely. And that's where it all started. And once they weren't honest then, you can't suddenly start being honest. You couldn't suddenly let the truth of all of it out. So again, I encourage you to read that because there's a whole section on Brexit, which is great.
No, but I agree with that. And also, freedom of movement, after the Eastern states, the so-called accession states joined the European Union after 2004, there was something called transition controls. 7 years, is it? 7 years transition controls. France, Germany, Spain, Italy, the big economies all imposed transition controls on the Eastern states. In other words, a block on freedom of movement. Blair didn't. Britain, Sweden, and Ireland didn't. So they immediately were opened for freedom of movement. And the Labour government of the time said their estimate was that there'd be between 8,000 and 13,000 people from the Eastern Europe arriving in Britain a year. 13,000? I mean, we know what happened. I mean, we know what the numbers were and the strains perhaps that put on.
It was 1 million in those intervening years, whereas 13,000 per year predicted.
There was no preparation, there was no open discussion, there was a series of botched promises, miscalculations. So you're right, it was a lot of it is bad government, a failure to talk openly about the truth of the matter.
It would have been really opening the whole book again, which wouldn't necessarily have been a bad thing. Yeah. One last question, if anyone's got one. That hand went up first, I'm sorry. Yes, I think your hand up went up. Can we get the mic, please?
The mic.
I'm just wondering how much you think that the concept of Englishness is affected by regionalism, because so many people will think of themselves as Cornish or from Tyneside or Yorkshire, and then they are English.
Yes. I agree with that, and that's, I like that. You know, I like the idea that we have multiple or compound or hyphenated identities. You know, you can be a Yorkshire woman, Muslim, English, and British. Some areas have less distinct local and regional identities, though, don't they? I mean, I mentioned Newcastle City Centre on a Saturday night. Very strong identity in Essex, actually. If you think of all of the counties in England, Essex has a particular identity, although it's a very diverse county. You have the sea, you have Epping Forest, you have rural Essex, you have the new towns and so on. But there's a particular caricature of Essex. We all know what it is. You know, the only way is Essex. Educating Essex. Can you imagine the only way is Bedfordshire? Or educating Hertfordshire? You know, it doesn't quite work, does it? Obviously, so certain parts of the country have much stronger identities to which people, therefore, are inevitably attached. I think that's good. That's all part of the diversity of the nation. Impossible questions to answer,
Well,
really,
amazing. And actually, you've brought us right back to the importance of community, which is where the whole book starts. So it's a perfect ending.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Jason. So much to cover. I really recommend the book. I'm not just saying that. I've learnt so much. Thank you so much for your questions. And Jason will be signing. So we're going to walk up to the marquee, I believe, which is where the book signing area is.
Get a cup. Thank you.
Thank you.